Hello again and welcome to another Morning and Glory Warhammer 40k Tournament After Action Report. That's right, it's time for some more dispatches from the front lines, and I am giddy with excitement for today's episode, guys, because I took not one, but two BANEBLADES to the tournament. That is right, I took two Guard Super Heavies into the competitive meta and somehow went undefeated. Now, in case you've not seen one of these tournament report videos before, this is what I like to do. I start off by going over the list that I took, taking you through why I selected certain units and overall what the strategy was behind the army build. I'll then go through what I call the lay of the land. This is where we talk about the terrain at the event and how competitive it was. Was it a bit of a friendly local RTT, or was it a complete shark tank? Once we've done all that groundwork and we've given the tournament a lot of context, I then dive into each individual game, taking you through step by step what happened and what were my decisions throughout the whole battle. We'll then wrap the video up with a summary and my final placing at the event. And so without further ado, let's crack on with this video and dive straight into today's episode. So I'd like to start off by saying a big thank you to Just Play Games for hosting and organising the tournament. Just Play is a hobby shop in Liverpool and it's a pretty good one, guys. If you ever find yourself in that area, I highly recommend that you check them out. They've got well-stocked shelves of 40k, Sigma and loads of other game systems. They're also really active in the tournament scene and they host multiple events every single month, from doubles events to beginner and entry-level tournaments, Age of Sigmar things, and also, of course, Warhammer 40k, and their regular Warhammer 40k event is called the Naughty K RTT. This was their February Naughty K event and it was incredibly well run. I have to say everything went seamlessly throughout the whole day and the team at Just Play Games did a fantastic job. The staff were really helpful, the rounds were incredibly well organised, everyone knew what the mission was, what was going on, what the terrain was meant to be. There was plenty of time for every single round with also just the right amount of time between each round to be able to recharge, refresh, reorganise your armies and get ready for the next game. Overall, it was just a really well run event. I certainly intend to go to more of their tournaments. In fact, it probably will become one of the regular ones that I attend every single month. So if you want to meet me and maybe we can play some games across the tabletop, check out the Naughty K events at Just Play Games. And once again, I want to say a massive thank you to them for hosting and organising a very good tournament. Okie dokie, let's crack on with the video proper and get to everyone's favourite bit, which is the list overview. Now I'm going to take you through the HQ choices, then any elites, troops, and finally we'll get to the bit that you're all really excited for, which is the two super heavies and why I picked these particular ones and all the sort of thoughts behind the units in the list. So starting off with the HQs, I took two Death Corps of Krieg Marshals. Now, don't worry if you're flicking through your codex and you can't find that HQ choice, you've not got a defective book. It's actually a Forge World option. These are currently my favourite HQ choices for the Guard. That very well may change in the future, but right now, I am highly recommending them to anyone who's playing Guard because they're basically Cadian Castellans, but 15 points cheaper. They hand out the reroll ones, they do 2 orders a turn, they're senior officers. They're Cadian Castellans, but they're just 35 points rather than being 50 points. There are a few minor differences, like the Marshal has got 1 less wound, but has a 4+ basic armor save. But you don't really care about the stats because Guard senior officers aren't there to do any fighting, they're just there to hand out auras and orders. Also, I've had this comment crop up a lot on battle reports and other tournament reports. Morning and Glory, how are you taking 2 senior officers in your army? Aren't they commandants? Can't they only be taken once? In the Arks of Omen supplement, you can spend a command point for the heroic support stratagem, which allows you to take 2 units that normally you could only take 1 of. So, for example, if you're taking 2 Space Marine captains, you can do that for a command point. If you want to take 2 commandants, you can do that for a command point. I think they've done it because obviously GW has limited everyone to taking 1 detachment now, but a lot of armies are fundamentally built around being able to take 2 of these senior officer or senior officer like models. So that's how I'm fitting 2 of them in. I'm using the heroic support stratagem. I then took a third HQ choice, which was a Cadian command squad, and I gave it all the usual trimmings. My officer had his free bolt pistol and power sword. There was a Master Vox in there, a medic, a regimental standard. I had spent a command point on the command squad so that it had the big bullshit banner Relic, its official name being the Finial of the Nemrodesh first, but really GW should just change it and everyone should just refer to it as the big bullshit banner because it is the best relic in the entire game. I'm not just saying the Guard Codex, I mean the entire game. If you don't know what it does, it lets you ignore all to hit modifiers, it lets you ignore all feel no pains, it lets you ignore all phase caps, it ignores any abilities that reduce damage, and not only is it affecting the command squad, but affects all core units within 6 inches. Which means all of my infantry are just running around at maximum overdrive all the time. It's really, really strong. And another side note, a thing that a lot of people forget about, is the aura of the big bullshit banner and of the regimental standard in general is not to the banner bearer, it's to the unit. So if you string out your command squad, you can really get this thing affecting a lot of units. I then took an attaché for my command squad and I went for an officer of the fleet. Now there were a couple of reasons I did this. Firstly, I had about 25 points left over at the end of the list, and I wasn't sure what to spend them on. I didn't want to start completely reworking the list or start messing around with some infantry squads being Cadian shock troops and some being Krieg. I didn't want to do anything like that, so I decided, you know what, I'll just spend the last 25 points on an attaché because it gives me an extra tool in the toolbox. I went with the officer of the fleet because I didn't have enough points for an Ashpath and I didn't have any artillery, so it wasn't really worth going for the massive ordnance. And also, the officer of the fleet is a really cool little tactical unit and he can mess up your opponent's plans in a really, really big way. The main reason you take him is because he has stratagem that allows you to delay the enemy reserves. You can stop your opponent from bringing in one unit from reserve for a turn. So if they try and bring in a drop pod turn 1, you can be like, nope, that's got to come in turn 2. If they try and deep strike a big unit of Terminators or something, turn 2, you can be like, no, that's not coming in until turn 3. Obviously, you don't want to gotcha your opponent. I mean, you can gotcha them if you want, but I always warned my opponents that this guy could do this. And what was interesting is he still had a really big impact on the battlefield, even if my opponent didn't put anything in reserve. Because often I would tell my opponent, oh, this guy is going to delay your reserves. He can do it. I was very clear. It's 1 unit. It's 2 CP. I can do it turn 1 or turn 2. I can't do it turn 3, so don't worry, units don't get destroyed in reserve. But every single time I explained to my opponents, they were like, oh, actually, that's quite a big deal. That's really going to mess up my initial plan. Okay, I'll alter my game plan a little bit, and I'm not going to put anything in reserve. Weirdly, often that actually was a sort of a mistake for my opponent, because by not putting stuff in reserve, it meant that things typically had to slog across the battlefield, and that gave me more time to shoot them. So it really does put your opponent in a catch-22. The officer of the fleet, you may not hear me mention much about him throughout the individual games because his delay reserve stratagem never came up, but I can tell you now, and I'll get it boxed off now, he was very impactful, and there were a couple of games where it did make a big difference. Moving on to the troops, I took 10 units of Death Corps of Krieg. I gave every single one of them double Melta, I gave each one a Medi-Pack, and the sergeant had last pistol and chainsword. If you've watched any of my recent battle reports or tournament reports, you know that I am all aboard the Krieg hype train. They are probably the best infantry unit in the Imperial Guard Codex right now. A lot of people are looking at Cadian shock troops, they're seeing the price point, they're seeing the double plasma, they're seeing the damage potential, and they are, in my opinion, getting slightly bamboozled by this. Because whilst Cadians do a lot of damage, the Imperial Guard is generally not struggling for damage output. What I need my infantry to do is be annoyingly durable and to be way tougher than my opponent expects. I need my infantry to be a screen. And if my screen is too easy to be destroyed, then it's not doing its primary function very well. So over the last few games, I have been pretty much transferring over to Cadian shock troops, and I've not regretted it in any way, shape or form. Obviously, it depends on what you're building your list for. Don't just naturally assume that Krieg are going to be the right choice for you. But the way I've been building my list, I have been wanting my infantry to basically die for the Emperor, but die for the Emperor on my terms. And in that regard, Krieg are vastly superior than Cadians. It's all about having the right infantry for the right job. And the reason I wanted my infantry primarily to be doing so much screening was because I had 2 Imperial Guard Super Heavies in my list. Now, before we get into why I took which Super Heavy and the thought behind all that kind of good stuff, let me talk about the infantry Super Heavy relationship that I wanted to execute with this army. Basically, my plan was to use each Super Heavy as a big block of mobile firepower. I know that Super Heavies can do some decent damage in combat. Baneblades have got 9 attacks, they're pretty high strength, pretty decent AP and damage, all that kind of good stuff, but their combat capability is much less than their shooting capability. Now, I know they're Titanic, so they can fall back and shoot and charge and all that kind of good stuff, but if they get wrapped and trapped, they can't do any of that stuff, and they have to sit there in combat, basically shooting the thing they're in combat with, which is what I don't want them to do that, okay? So my plan was, I'm just going to treat these as if I was running 2 squadrons of Leman Russes. I'm going to play them exactly the same way. And so if I was running a normal guard army, and I was running 4 or 5 Leman Russes, I would screen those Russes out with 100 infantry, so those Russes could do their job without having to worry about getting wrapped, trapped, or any other kind of shenanigans. But I'll stop blueballing you guys, because I know the main reason you're all here is the Super Heavies. And yeah, that's right, I included 2 Imperial Guard Super Heavy tanks in my army. I had a Baneblade. It is the Baneblade. You've got to say it in that voice every single time, guys. It's just the law, apparently. And then I also took a Hellhammer. The Hellhammer doesn't have a funny voice, but I'll do it anyway. The Hellhammer. There you go. So 1 Baneblade and 1 Hellhammer. These 2 tanks come absolutely filled to the brim with loads and loads of different guns. Basically, they have the same weapons apart from the main big gun on top. Each Super Heavy does come with a Demolisher cannon in the front. It comes with a twin heavy bolter in the front as well. It then comes with, as standard, 2 sponsons, each sponson containing another 2 heavy bolters for a total of 6 heavy bolters, and they also come with 2 las cannons as well. Each tank also comes with a heavy stubber, which is pretty cool, and then you have a coaxial autocannon. The coaxial autocannon is basically like a normal autocannon, but it benefits from the turret weapon special rule, which is pretty neat because Baneblades as standard only hit on a 4+. All of the demolished cannons, heavy bolters, lance cannons, heavy stubber, all that kind of stuff, that hits on a 4+. But the coaxial autocannon and the main gun hits on a 3+ thanks to the turret weapon special rule. Like I said, the big difference between these 2 tanks really is the main gun in the top. The Baneblade comes with the inspirationally and imaginatively named Baneblade cannon, and the Hellhammer clearly was designed by the same guy because it comes with the Hellhammer cannon. 10 out of 10 for functionality, minus several million for style to the Departamento Munitorum for that one. But I digress. We're not here to talk about the naming conventions within the Adeptus Administratum. The Baneblade comes with 3d6 shots at a 72-inch range, strength 9, AP -3, flat 3 damage, and blast. And the Hellhammer cannon comes with 3d6 plus 6 shots, so it can potentially get 24 shots in one go, at strength 7, AP -2, flat 2 damage, but it also ignores cover and again is also blast. Generally speaking, the Baneblade is seen as a jack of all trades, master of none. I mean, clearly it is a master of something. It is the master of war. But apart from that, it is seen as the take-all-comers super heavy for Imperial Guard commanders. You're not sure what scenario you're going to find yourself in, but you know you're going to need a super heavy for it. Take a Baneblade. Pretty much can't go wrong with it. The Hellhammer is seen as a little bit more specialist. It's a bit pricier. It's 20 points more than a Baneblade, but realistically at this point, 20 points is nothing. You're already spending hundreds and hundreds of points on these things. And it is a more specialized anti-infantry killer. It's designed for rooting out any kind of infantry, be it light, medium, or even heavy, because of that strength 7, you pretty much be wounding anything on 3s, even the toughest opponents. They're not going to get any kind of cover save. The AP -2 tends to be more than enough, because either you're shooting light and medium infantry, which don't have invulnerable saves, and getting them down by AP -2 is more than enough. And if you end up hitting heavy infantry with it, like Terminators, the fact they're going to go from a 2-up save to a 4+ save typically means you're bumping into some kind of invuln. So it's designed for killing and rooting out any kind of infantry from cover, and it does that job very, very well. Now, I took an extra step here with my Super Heavies, and I gave my Baneblade the vaunted Praetorian tank case. I figured that my tank wasn't expensive enough already. I might as well really take it to the gold standard and slap another 30 points on this thing, which meant that in total it cost a sweet 500 points exactly. And what this allows it to do is do tank orders to Super Heavies. It can order itself, it can order the Hellhammer, it doesn't matter. It can do tank orders, and specifically is allowed to order Super Heavies around, because normally Super Heavies can't receive orders. So this is really nice. I use this for pretty much 2 things. 1, giving reroll 1s to hit via Gunner's Kill on Sight, or using Pound Them Into Dust to make sure that I got maximum shots from one of my cannons. The reason why the second order is so important is because the Baneblade cannon is actually really swingy. The Hellhammer one's fine. The Hellhammer cannon tends to, even if you roll fairly low, because it's got that inbuilt +6 shots, it always tends to do what it needs to do and get enough shots that it needs to get for its job. The Baneblade cannon is super swingy. Honestly, I spent a lot of CP this tournament just re-rolling the number of shots in the Baneblade cannon to try and get it to actually put out a reasonable amount of firepower. I rolled 111 more than once on the Baneblade cannon. So I ended up using Pound Them Into Dust quite a bit, because it meant that I could see an enemy unit that had like 6 or 7 models in it and be like, Pound Them Into Dust, oh look, now you count as having double models for blast purposes, oh look, suddenly I'm getting the big 18 shots from my Baneblade gun. So I actually found that to be really, really helpful, but it was something that I hadn't even thought about going into the tournament. I just thought it's going to be reroll 1s for days, bro, but actually Pound Them Into Dust was really, really helpful with that swingy Baneblade cannon. Now, I know some of you are going to be asking, okay, Mordian Glory, that's what you took for your Super Heavies, but why did you take those Super Heavies? Why did you take the Baneblade and the Hellhammer? Was it some kind of 5D chess wrinkly brain maneuver, or was it something else? I'm going to be honest with you guys, it had nothing to do with tactical acumen or genius, alright? I have got an Ogren brain at the end of the day. It's as smooth as a baby's bottom. I don't know where that expression comes from, it's a bit weird, but it's a smooth one. That's what it is. It's the most least wrinkly brain you'll ever find. I took these 2 Super Heavies simply because they're the ones I owned that were fully built and painted. I had a Bane sword, but it wasn't painted. I had a Machias Vanquisher, but I don't like handicapping myself any more than I have to, and also it wasn't built or painted, so it wasn't really an option. Sorry to all my Machias Vanquisher fans out there, that just got the backhanded insult. Now, that covers the most salient parts of the list. There are 1 or 2 other things that I just want to mention. The last unit that I haven't talked about is I took a Tech Priest Engineer. He was there to basically put a 5+ invulnerable save on one of the tanks each turn, and also to be able to heal D3 wounds. I find that the Baneblades, of course, draw quite a lot of firepower. They tend to draw a lot of anti-tank firepower. And when you start getting hit by things like Melta guns and whatnot, Toughness 9 is great, but it puts you on a 6-up save most of the time. So being able to have a 5+ invulnerable save is actually pretty nice. I also should mention that I spent 1 CP on Officer Cadre on my platoon command squad, and I gave my platoon commander the superior tactical training warlord trait, and I went for Prefectus orders. This means that he can do Prefectus orders in a 24-inch range, thanks to him being an officer with a Master Vox, which is pretty good. It makes them really flexible, allows you to fall back and shoot wherever you need it. And I should also mention that for my Regimental Doctrines, I just went for Born Soldiers. No messing around today, no trying to find other combinations that might work. I figured I'm taking essentially what is a hybrid guard list. Sure, sort of Russes, we've got Baneblades, but it's basically infantry and tanks at the end of the day. And so I need a Regimental Doctrine that supports a hybrid guard army most effectively. And that's why I went with Born Soldiers. General game plan was actually pretty straightforward. I was going to essentially form the army into 2 distinctive little mini armies with a super heavy, a senior officer, and 50 infantry at the heart of each formation, with the command squad wherever it might seem most useful, and with the engineer wherever it might seem that that particular super heavy was going to need that 5% vulnerable save or was going to need repairing over the course of the battle. General game plan was to buy these super heavies enough time with the infantry screening so that they could do loads of damage to my opponent and also still have enough infantry left over to be able to hold objectives. I figured that in most games I would be reacting to my opponent for the first couple of turns. I'm a relatively slow army, and so that I would be winning most games turn 3, turn 4, turn 5, rather than trying to get an early lead games 1 and 2. That was kind of my thoughts with this list, how it was going to play and what I wanted to get out of it in each one of my games. So now let's take a look at the lay of the land. How competitive was this event? Well, to start off, I should say it was a 1-day RTT and there were 3 games played over the course of the tournament. Overall, I would describe the competitiveness of the event as it was a semi-competitive tournament. At the end of the day, it's still a tournament. People are still trying to do their best. They're putting their best foot forward. They're trying to win. But there was no real net list there. Most people had what I would call a Johnny Rambo list, something that they had concocted themselves. They hadn't got it from anywhere else. And there wasn't really any Sharks or Whacker or Cutthroat players. Most people were there to play models and have a good time, but still try their best and do really, really well. For me, I found the event incredibly refreshing. I've been going to a lot of Shark Tanks recently, and it was nice just to be able to play in a friendly local tournament with friendly local players. And the last thing I want to mention about the lay of the land is the terrain. Now, the terrain was a really big factor in me taking the double super heavy list to this event, because I have played at Just Play tournaments before, and they have a slightly unique twist on the terrain they like to feature at their events. They use plenty of L shapes, there's lots of ruins, but they tend to use a bit more dense terrain than a lot of other tournaments and slightly less big L-shaped ruins. I actually really like this approach because dense terrain allows you to still curb those shooting armies. You're still handing out manners to hit modifiers left, right and centre. But it also means that you get a little bit more maneuverability. You can't just hop from one piece of terrain to the next just in a straight line. You might have to take a slightly circuitous route if you're an assault army. And also it means that you can actually move big models around. And so I knew going into this event that I would actually be able to use the super heavies and they wouldn't get trapped in my deployment zone. A big problem with Baneblades is they're so massive that at most tournaments that are using things like WTC terrain, you literally can't deploy your Baneblade and have it move outside of your deployment zone. It's just stuck there for the whole game, covering a pretty pathetic fire lane, and your opponent can just avoid it. So I knew going into this event this wouldn't be a problem. Just Play tends to have a policy of there should always be room for a knight to maneuver around, and no matter what the model, there should always be space, at least one place on the board where you can deploy it and one channel that you can move it down to get it from one side of the board to the other. I really like this policy. It definitely gets 2 thumbs up from me. I think it's something that other tournament organisers should consider, having the same amount of terrain but just taking out a few of the ruins, putting a bit more dense in, because it does allow people to run those more fun models. He wasn't at this event, but there is a regular player at these Just Play tournaments who turns up with an Ork Stomper. And yeah, the Stomper gets smashed every single time, but at least it's not depressing just looking at it sat there in its deployment zone unable to do anything. It stomps around the battlefield and it looks great doing it. But with all that said and done, let's crack on with the games. And let's start off with game number 1, which should have been against Iron Warriors. I say should have been because my opponent didn't turn up. It's not that there were an uneven number of players at the event, he just didn't turn up to game number 1. He didn't turn up to the event in total, which was a bit of a strange one because he had signed in to BCP the night before, or maybe 2 days before, and said, yes, I'm coming to the event. And then the day before, when he'd seen the pairings, everything was fine. And then he just didn't turn up to the event. So it was a bit of a strange one. And I want to assure everyone that's watching this video that the other 2 games in the tournament were much, much better, were a lot more fun. But I just want to spend a few minutes going through this game, going through what my opponent had, and sort of going through how I think the game would have gone. Just touch upon it. Now, I do want to mention that by getting the bye, I did count as technically getting a 100-0 win. I would have much preferred to have played the game and lost it and actually played the game. I don't like getting buys. Buys aren't fun because it means you just sat around doing nothing. And also, especially from my point of view, when I'm trying to make tournament after action reports, it's kind of rubbish. Oh yeah, got to buy, got to win technically under the belt. Great. Do you know what I mean? It's not a good way to start off, but it was out of my control, guys. Nothing I could do. But at the end of the day, it is a win. Getting a win by default is still a victory. And as we all know, the best form of being correct is being technically correct. So there we are. Now, there are a few reasons why I think my opponent might have turned up. I think, firstly, he could have simply just not wanted to play on the day. He might have been unwell. The event was on a Saturday. In the UK, people tend to go out on the lash on a Friday and have a few drinks. So maybe he woke up in the morning and was like, oh my God, I'm so hungover, I don't want to turn up. All of those real world reasons are probably why he didn't turn up. But I like to think there are two other possibilities. Firstly, he saw the Imperial might made manifest with the Baneblade and the Hellhammer, and he decided that he was not going to even dare turn up to the event, and he was intimidated off the field of battle. The battle that you can win without ever having to draw your sword is the ultimate victory. Something, Sun Tzu, probably. So there's that possibility, that he was just completely cooked by the Baneblades. Or there is another possibility, which I find equally as amusing, which is that my opponent wanted to win the tournament, and he saw the first matchup and realised, that's a terrible matchup. There's no way I can possibly win that. I'm not going to waste my time. And so he decided that if he couldn't win the first game, he wasn't going to win any of his games. Now I know what you're thinking. Some of you are thinking, Mordian Glory, that last one sounds totally bonkers. If you've paid for an event, surely you'd want to turn up to it. You wouldn't just throw a whole event before you've even played the game. It's a dice game. Anything could happen. Well, I agree with you guys, but I know of multiple people who have signed up to super major tournaments, sometimes even international super major tournaments. They've paid for the ticket, the travel, and all of the accommodation, hundreds of pounds, and they've seen the first pairing and gone, nope, there's no point in me going. I am going to win that event. That matchup is terrible. There's just no way I can possibly win it. There's no point in me turning up, losing my first game, being unable to win the tournament, and then having to spend the rest of the time just playing games that mean nothing to me. And they've just not gone. And what they tend to do instead is then try and get a last-minute tournament ticket to another event and go to that one in the hopes that they'll be able to get a more favourable pairing. Crazy, I know. I'm sure there's people who have their reasons for doing that, but it's not an uncommon thing that I've heard of, and I have actually seen it with my own two eyes. But I want to be 100% clear here. I have absolutely no evidence, and I'm not suggesting for any second that my opponent had this attitude. I just sort of wanted to use this opportunity to highlight this strange attitude and phenomenon within the competitive 40k community. As far as I'm aware, my opponent could simply have just forgotten to turn up, or something else much more important than playing toy soldiers came up in his life, and that was why he wasn't able to make it to the event. And to be honest, I don't think my opponent was that kind of player because of the list he was bringing. It was an Iron Warriors list. Iron Warriors right now have got about a 30% win rate, so nothing to be overly excited about. And also, off the top of my head, his list wasn't overly competitive. The reason I say off the top of my head, guys, is because his name was deleted from the tournament for the purpose of the TO being able to track things a little bit easier, so I don't have his list to hand anymore, but I did glance over it when I was waiting during my game, and his list was basically a bit of an eclectic mix. There was like a Venom Crawler in there, there was some Cultists in there, there was a couple of squads of Legionnaires in there. The main power in his list was this big block of Terminators. Now, I believe the Iron Warriors have got all sorts of relics and shenanigans that they can put on their Terminators to make them super duper jaw, but I think it's either -1 to wound or -1 damage. It's one or the other. I think it's -1 to wound is their big relic. To be honest, if that was the fulcrum of his list, if that was the really big main hitting part of it, I think that would have been a big problem for him. Because either he puts his Terminators in reserve, at which point I'm like, 2CP, these guys ain't coming in until turn 3, and I am going to kill the rest of your army in 2 turns with all of my firepower, all of my ball control. You might not even be able to deploy them anywhere if I use Remain Vigilant and I spread it out across loads of squads and all that kind of good stuff. It may have been that he would have not been able to deep strike in anywhere at all, or at least nowhere useful, with 2-3 turns of guard shenanigans. And then they may have dropped in to find the rest of the army just dead. So either he deep strikes them and the officer of the fleet goes, yoo-hoo, or he doesn't deep strike them and he footslogs them up the board, at which point this big unit of 10 Iron Warrior Terminators are going to get absolutely blasted by a Baneblade and by a Hellhammer. And combined, those two tanks would have no issue dealing with that. Considering each wound that goes through from the Baneblade is going to just splat a Terminator, because I believe it is -1 to wound. Correct me down in the comment section if I'm wrong, but I believe it is -1 to wound. I could happily go, right, I'm going to pound them into dust on the Baneblade. It's now going to count that 10-man squad of Terminators as a 20-man squad of Terminators. I'm going to get 18 shots from the main cannon. I'm going to spend a CP for ingrained precision so that I auto wound on 5 and 6s. I'm going to get 6 auto wounds on you with this unit. And then I'm going to get 6 other hits on you, of which 4 are going to wound you. So for a total of 10 wounds on those Terminators. I believe they've got a 5+ invulnerable save, but let's be generous and say they've got a 4+. It means half of those 10 wounds are going to go through statistically, and that's 5 Terminators just squished from just the Baneblade cannon in 1 turn. And I can just do that 2 turns in a row, and I'm not even taking into account all of the heavy bolters or the Demolisher cannon or the autocannon or any of the other shots. There's a very high chance that the Baneblade basically makes them combat ineffective in a single volley by itself. Of course, we'll never know for certain because the game didn't take place, but knowing what I know about this list and giving you a little bit of foreshadowing and getting you hyped up for the other games, I think that the Baneblades would have absolutely dominated that list. It did not have a huge amount of long-range shooting. I had the tools for dealing with all of his combat units because I had enough screening, and I had the ability to really mess up his main unit with the Terminators with all of my deep strike, or anti-deep strike shenanigans, I should say. So I was confident, knowing what I know now, that that game probably would have been a win. But as it was a win anyway. Technically a win. So there we go. But that was the first game. Now let's get into the second and third game, and I promise you guys that these ones are very, very good. So game number 2 rolls around, and I finally have a worthy opponent. The Undying Legions of the Necrons decided that they wanted to test their mettle against the might of the Imperium's super heavy armoured cavalry corps. Now, the mission for game number 2 was Death and Zeal. This is a 5 objective mission where you've got to hold 1 objective to get 4 points, hold 2 to get more, hold 3 to get even more. And the second part of the primary is where you have to destroy an enemy unit that's holding an objective, or I believe hold an objective that you hadn't held at the beginning of the turn. For secondary objectives, I took Inflexible Command, Boots on the Ground, because those 2 are my staple for any Imperial Guard list, and I also took No Prisoners. I was facing Necrons. A lot of Necrons, and I figured that between the number of models I was facing, and don't worry, I'll get into my opponent's list in just a second, and also the fact that they reanimate, there's probably a good chance I'm gonna max No Prisoners out easy peasy. So that was why I took those secondaries. My opponent went for No Prisoners as well, because obviously I've got lots of infantry, and then he went for Technology of Aeons and also Ancient Machinery. Always try and remember that third Necron secondary. Those are pretty much the standard Necron secondaries as well. You take those 2 and then you have a little think about what the third one's going to be. So we both had a couple of secondaries that were special to our army that we could score pretty reliably, and then it was going to come down to who could kill the most out of each other to really max out that No Prisoners. We both had plenty of OBSEC, so going into this game, Prime was all to play for. Overall, it was actually a pretty interesting matchup. Now, my opponent had a very interesting list. It's one that I've seen talked about around the competitive water cooler, but not one that I've ever actually faced off against myself. He basically had what I would describe as a Scarab Swarm pressure list. This is where you take an obscene number of Scarabs and you swarm the enemy with them as quickly as possible, take advantage of the fact that point for point they've got a shitload of wounds. You can put 5 up invulnerable saves on them. They're actually pretty good at eating almost any unit out there because they've got like auto wounds in combat. And also, they're just so frustrating to deal with that your opponent spends the first couple of turns just chewing through scarabs. And by the time he's finally fought his way out of his deployment zone, you've put 20 plus warriors on every single objective, and it's probably game over at that point. Your opponent can't get back into the primary game. They've probably not scored all that much secondary against you, and you end up winning on points, which is a great way to play. I like it. It's certainly a bit more interesting than the we're just going to take a bunch of Scorpet destroyers and sit them on all the middle objectives and do nothing. This one does have a little bit more excitement to it. So I really liked the list. Now, he had 3 squads of 9 scarabs, 3 squads of 20 warriors. He had a big squad of Necron heavy destroyers. He had a couple of tomb spiders, which are there to be able to put more scarabs back in the swarm. So even if you do end up killing them, he can start bringing them back, which is really crazy. He had a character with the Veil of Shadows. He had another cat that could hand out 5 from vulnerable saves. He had a Necron Lord with the big mega resurrection orb. And that was pretty much his whole list. So 27 scarab bases, 60 warriors, 3 or 4 characters, 3 heavy destroyers, and a couple of tomb spiders. Oh, and also, lest I forget, the Nightbringer has a pretty important model. Now, in terms of deployment, I immediately break my own game plan, because I had initially started out by thinking I'm going to have my infantry at the front, my Baneblades behind, the infantry's going to have to buy time for the Baneblades to do their work. But unfortunately, on this board, the only real place I could put the Baneblades and have them physically be able to move around were on the front line, specifically on the top left flank. So that is exactly where I placed them, and I figured that actually this wouldn't be the end of the world. Sure, the Nightbringer could do some nasty things to my bum, but he is only one model, and if the rest of the scavs come swarming in, then the Baneblade actually has a pretty good chance of just running them over and being able to shoot its way out of combat without any issues. Because if the scavs come swarming in, the Baneblade can use crush them. It gets 9 attacks. It should hit with 6 of them. It should wound with all of them. Even with a 5% vulnerable save, the scarab should fail 4 of those saves, and then suddenly that's 2 of their bases just wiped out. Now, 7 scarab swarm bases are going to find it really difficult to completely surround the Baneblade or any of the super heavies, and so he probably couldn't wrap and trap me. And I figured that he probably couldn't. He might have been able to do some things like some warriors, some other shenanigans, but again, I'm not too worried about being in combat with the Baneblade, because I can still shoot its turret out without any issues, and I can shoot all its other guns just into combat and having a great time. So it wasn't where I wanted them to be, but I figured that actually in this matchup, it wasn't as risky as it would have been against certain other high-pressure armies. I figured I could probably outlast the Scarab Swarms. Now, this actually turned out to be the right call, because my opponent saw me sort of frontlining my super heavies, and he ended up playing it quite cagey with his deployment. I think that maybe he misplaced one of his characters, because he had the characters that could hand out the 5 vulnerable saves were near the back of his deployment zone. Really, they should have been at the front, because that meant he had to have his scarabs near the back of his deployment zone, and he should have had those guys up front so that they could just rush out there and tie me up, assuming he gets first turn. But he didn't go for that. Maybe he was thinking, well, if he doesn't get turn 1, he doesn't want me to pick up all the scarabs, and then his main trick is just gone. I get that. As it turned out, I wasn't able to target any of his scarabs because he had deployed them fairly far back, so maybe that part of his plan worked. But if it had been me, I would have been like, warriors can go back, scabs can take all the terrain up front, take all the outside blocking, and having a great time. But there we are. Now, I ended up getting first turn. My opponent had done a good job of hiding nearly all his units, but there was one unit of warriors that he couldn't do anything about. I could just see them, and this was the unit that was actually furthest forward, and it was on his side of the big L shapes in the middle, near where the Nightbringer was. Now, even with the dense terrain slowing my super heavies down, I was able to move them far enough forward, get all my buffs off, like reroll 1s to hit, 5% vulnerable save, all that kind of good stuff, that I could peek them round the corner and have a pretty easy line of sight to the tail end of his warrior unit. I ended up firing the Hellhammer first, and because there were 20 warriors in the squad, it got maximum shots, and it killed 19 of them in one go. This was really unfortunate because I really needed it to kill all 20 of them, but because it only killed 19 of them, they were able to reanimate. And my opponent did very well on his reanimations and he got 10 of them back. Now, there were a couple of factors here that made it so the Hellhammer didn't wipe them all out. Firstly, my opponent had the dynasty where he gets to ignore AP -1 when he's in his deployment zone. Of course, he was in his deployment zone, so he ignored AP -1. Secondly, I, with all of my other guns, got the warriors down to just 3. And then it was down to the heavy bolters. Now, with my 18 heavy bolter shots with ingrained precision, I did 10 wounds to my opponent. And there's 3 warriors left. So even on a 4-up, it's pretty much a done deal. I think it might have even been 12 wounds. It was something obscene, guys. And my opponent proceeds to pass all of his saves except 2. Which means that this 1 warrior stays alive. Then he gets really lucky on his reanimations and brings half the squad back. So this was a little frustrating, but it doesn't matter. It's one of those things. Sometimes the dice go your way, sometimes they don't. Now, that meant that basically I was like, right, I can't have my... And he has the big resurrection orb that he can bring the rest of the squad back pretty much if he wants to. So I was like, you know what? This warrior squad has to just die. So I then put everything from the Baneblade into it, and I just wipe them out, just completely flatten them. Didn't even need to fire the rest of the guns. The main cannon just did all of the work. It rolled poorly the first time, CPU reroll, it rolled fine. So my first turn, I've rolled up with the cavalry, I've blown away a unit of 20 warriors, and my infantry has been kind of cautious. I've moved them up into positions where they'll be able to jump on the middle objective turn 2, but I didn't go for it turn 1. And I've also moved them up so that they're going for that top left objective as well. I figured that I could seed primary for a turn in order to be able to then let my opponent come out, expose himself a bit, and then blow him off table. Having seen that my Hellhammer could pretty much single-handedly kill a unit of warriors without even trying, considering that I had only 2 squads of warriors left to go through, I figured that if my opponent did push out and go all in, I would actually be able to bring a lot of firepower to bear, and that would advantage me. So I stayed back a little bit in the hopes that he would take the bait, push out and try and take over all of those objectives. And for the most part, my opponent did that. He ended up moving all his scarabs and his warriors up round to the top left so that he was threatening where my super heavies were. The Nightbringer came flying in down that flank as well. He had another unit of scarabs that ended up, 2 units of scarabs that were going down round the bottom flank as well. And then my opponent did something which I think was a big mistake. In his turn 1, he uses the Veil of Shadows to transport a character and a full block of warriors over to the objective that's on the bottom right, the one you can see in this picture now. This was a mistake in my opinion, because he did that because he wanted to hold the objective, he wanted to hold it beyond a shadow of a doubt, he didn't want me to just to snatch it off him. I get it, I understand why he's done it. But by doing that, he has essentially taken 33% of his warriors out of the fight. Now, bear in mind, I've already killed 33% of them. Voluntarily taking another third out just means that's just 20 less warriors I have to deal with. And I wasn't really going towards that objective anyway. If he just teleported the character alone over there, that would have worked. If he teleported the character over there and then had all of the warriors deploy on the other side of the ruin and start working on that flank, that would have made a lot of sense. But he didn't want to lose all of his warriors again to the mighty firepower of the 2 super heavies. Maybe that was the right call. Obviously, I can pick up a squad of warriors easily a turn. I could probably pick up 2 squads of warriors given half a chance. Maybe that was the right call. But in my opinion, it basically meant that I had indirectly sort of pseudo killed another 20 warriors without having to fire a shot, because they were taken out of the fight and they were on an objective I didn't care about. Now, for the rest of my opponent's turn 1, he ends up doing his heavy destroyers into the Baneblade, doing 12 wounds to that, and he ends up doing 18 wounds to the Hellhammer using the Nightbringer in combat and all of the Nightbringer's various mortal wound shenanigan psychic powers. If he had concentrated fire on one super heavy, he would have killed it. But he ended up splitting fire, and the reason for that was he didn't want his heavy destroyers to end up just bouncing off the 5+ invulnerable save of the Hellhammer, because I only got a 6-up save if he targeted the Baneblade. That was probably the right call. I did actually make a couple of 5-up saves. Well, I failed, I should say, a couple of 6-up saves by rolling 5s against his Destroyer shooting, which is why the Baneblade ended up taking so much damage. But, you know, benefit of hindsight is he would have destroyed one of the super heavies turn 1, which would have been a pretty big deal. Now, it then swings back over to my turn, and my opponent is pretty exposed. Funnily enough, I actually ended up doing 6 wounds to his Nightbringer in his turn, because I overwatched it, and then I crushed it. And the funny thing is I like to imagine that the robe of the Nightbringer started getting sucked into the tracks of the Hellhammer. It's like, no, and he just gets sucked in, because basically he starts getting, like, sucked in. I fall back with the Hellhammer. I make it operate on full bracket. I blast away a full unit of warriors with the Hellhammer. I then blast away a full unit of Scarabs with the Baneblade, and then the Hellhammer charges back in against the Nightbringer, crushes it, and just runs it over again. So I do like to think that basically the Nightbringer's cloak got stuck in the track of the Baneblade, and he ended up getting sucked through it, which is not a dignified end for a Star God, to say the least. Sorry, there was a slight mistake. I didn't take out a warrior block my turn 2 with the Hellhammer. The Hellhammer took out the heavy destroyers, and the Baneblade took out the unit of Scarabs. But going into my opponent's turn 2, he has got left a unit of warriors that are marching forward onto my top left objective, a unit of warriors which have basically been taken out of the fight, and 1 unit of Scarabs left over. That's it. He's got a few characters bumming around in the centre, but he's taken some really big losses in the first 2 turns. But he can bring it back if he just destroys one of my super heavies and then swarms me with a big unit of Scarabs. He can actually bring it back, and if he can get his Tomb Spiders into the fight as well, because those things are pretty big models. My infantry are, aren't really designed for dealing with them. Melta guns are very swingy. They might do it, they might not. So my opponent goes for it. He moves his 20 warriors forward, and he goes absolutely ham on my Hellhammer. Bear in mind, the Nightbringer had exploded and done loads of mortal wounds. The Hellhammer, even though it had been healed, was back down to like 9 wounds in total. And my opponent, with his warriors, he senses blood in the water. He's like, right, I'm going to put like 3 or 4 CP into his warrior squad. So they're like ignoring all the cover. They've got My Will Be Done on them. They've got the 6s to auto wound when they hit. They've got all this stuff going on. And all of this lightning, 40 Necron warrior Reaper Gauze shots just slam into the front of this 9 wound Hellhammer. I like to imagine that the front of the thing starts glowing red hot. The green lightning arcing over its hull, melting the gold Aquillas, scorching it down to its bare metal. But it holds. Big factor in it holding is the fact that even though the Reapers are AP -2, Baneblades come with armor tracks inbuilt. Reapers are only damage 1, and that means I've got a 3-up save. My opponent ends up doing 17 wounds to me with his warriors, and like my opponent had done to me in turn 1 with his warriors, now it was my turn to not fail the saves, and I only, out of 17 armor saves, I failed 2. 17 3-ups. I failed 2. Now, statistically, it was kind of with me anyway, because obviously I should have failed statistically about 6. That would have left me with 3 wounds left over, roughly. So that's fine. But I should have failed way more than 2. But it's a dice game. It very much could have gone the other way. And 17 wounds is a lot of wounds, guys. That can easily get away from you. It would have been not out of the realms of possibility for me to fail 10 armor saves there at all. Or even 9 armor saves. Not even hard. So, as it was, though, the Emperor protects! And the Hellhammer withstood the onslaught. And unfortunately, that basically signaled the doom of my opponent's army. Because I've still got 2 super heavies in the fight. I can still repair them. I don't think I had the CP to make it relentless turn 3, but I easily could have husbanded my CP and made it relentless turn 4. My opponent has literally gone all in and essentially bounced. The Scarabs went flying in down at the bottom into 2 squads of Krieg. But between my opponent splitting his attacks, between the Krieg Medi-Packs, and between the fact that I actually get an armor save against these things, I actually ended up only losing like 1 or 2 guys from each squad, which wasn't really a big deal. My turn 3, I clean up the rest of the warriors that I can see, the rest of the scouts that I can see, and I even pick up the Necron Lord and the Cryptek that I've been getting into a bit of a Barney with my infantry in the centre of the board. Going over to my opponent's turn 3, and we essentially call it, we've been playing a very sort of fun, slow game anyway. We've been having lots of banter. I think my opponent was absolutely lovely, by the way. One of the most chill guys that I've played against in a long time. And even though he was getting like crushed by these Baneblades, he was really into it. He was like, the Baneblade! And I was like, yes, the Baneblade! He was really like, we had an absolutely fantastic game. But we get to turn 3 and we basically call it, because my opponent ends up starting his turn 3 or his turn 4 basically with just a unit of warriors hiding behind a ruin and a couple of characters hiding on his home objective, or a character with Tomb Spider. That was basically it. And at this point I've got 2 damaged super heavies, but both of which perfectly able to function, perfectly able to fight. They can operate at full capacity, and I've only lost about 50 infantry, so my casualties aren't that heavy at all. So we end up calling it at the end of, I think, Necron turn 3, Necron turn 4, and it ended up being a pretty decisive win for the Guard. I ended up getting about 97 victory points. I maxed out primary. I maxed out nearly all of my secondaries except for boots on the ground. I didn't quite max that one. And my opponent ended up with actually a very respectable score as well, because he's Necrons at the end of the day. He had beaten me or equaled me on the primary game for the first 1 or 2 turns, so that had allowed him to do some stuff there and get a lot of his secondaries off as well. So I believe the Necron player ended up with about 70 points at the end of the game as well. So not a bad score from him in any way, shape or form, but the Guard had truly crushed the enemy beneath their iron treads. So after an exciting and decisive game number 2, it was time to go into game number 3. And oh boy, was this going to be a different experience, because this game literally turned out to be the polar opposite of game number 1, because I was facing off against the Goth Pressure list. Now, for those of you that don't know, Goth Pressure is one of the most competitive and powerful Orc builds that you can do right now with your green-skinned menace. When you see Orcs winning tournaments, they're doing it because of Goth Pressure. Okay, how the list works is you take as many of the Squig Riders as you can. You take as many of these units that you can just throw into your opponent's face. You're looking at basically putting a huge amount of pressure on your opponent, pinning them into their deployment zone, having so many boys and so many riders and so many assets just flung at them that they spend the whole game just under an immense amount of pressure, really struggling to get out of their deployment zone. And the whole time you are just scoring your primary points, you are scoring your secondary points, and by the time, if they even are able to, by the time they have fought out of the Goth Pressure, the opponent finds themselves very battered, because Orcs are pretty good at battering you, and also in a position where the Orcs have basically already run away with 90 odd points, and there's not much you can really do about it. So I was facing against that kind of list, and whilst the Scour Pressure list was kind of an interesting experiment, this was a tried and tested tactic from the Orc community. I was also playing against a very experienced Orc player. I know of this person. They are famous in their club. They always run Orcs. They've run Orcs for just years and years. They know what they're doing. So we've got an experienced commander running an experienced list going up against me with my Baneblades. It was going to be a toughie. To compound this issue even further, we were playing Data Scry Salvage. Now, this is a 6 objective mission which requires you to hold 2 objectives to get any primary points whatsoever, which means I can't even sit in my deployment zone for the first couple of turns and still score away a few primary points to keep me ticking over. I can't do that. If I do that, my opponent is going to be running away with primary, and I'm going to be sat on 0 most of the game, which is not a position that I want to be in. However, there are a couple of factors in my favour. Firstly, I massively outgunned my opponent. I mean, literally, completely and utterly outgunned my opponent. I think the only real dedicated firepower in her list was the fact that she had 2 units of Mega Knobs that had loads of rocket launchers on them, and that was really it. outside of that, everyone's running around with pistols and spears and knives and all that kind of good stuff. So I've got the fire superiority, which is very, very nice. And the other factor is that whilst this is a Goth pressure list, this isn't a net list Sean Naden version of the pressure list, as far as I'm aware. My opponent had put her own twist on it, or she was just using the models that she liked. The tactic was definitely Goth pressure, though. So, in terms of what my opponent was running, just to go through it in detail, there were 3 units of 5 of the Squig Hog Riders. I will inevitably keep referring to them as Boar Boys, because I'm an old school fantasy player at heart. And then there were 2 or 3 units of Beast Snaggers. There were I think there were 3 units of Beast Snaggers, 3 units of Ork Boys, 3 units of Grots, 3 units of these Boar Riders, like I said. Then there was the big boss on the big squig. There was a warp head, what I call it, a sorcerer, a mage, whatever you want to call it. Someone doing the jump, basically. And then there was also Gaz, who was an interesting sight. So Gaz was there. Not so much a problem for me, because even though I'm shooty dominated, I've got the big bullshit banner of ignoring phase caps. And then also there were these 2 5-man squads of Mega Knobs. Now, for deployment, I end up going with a slightly risky strategy, but one that I hope will pay off. My instinct is to deploy far back, make sure that my opponent gets no turn 1 charges, and really just let them run forward into no man's land and get shot up. But the problem with this plan is that my opponent can move from cover to cover, and will move from cover to cover if given half an opportunity. And really, they're going to be running at me very quickly anyway. And if I cede too much ground, I've not got a very maneuverable army. At most, my infantry is going 12 inches a turn. There's a lot of dens, so a lot of the time I'm going to be moving 10 inches a turn with my infantry, 8 inches a turn with the Baneblades. So by deploying too far back, I could actually be screwing myself over. So instead, I decide to go for a little bit of a bait deployment, a little bit of a trap. And what I do is I deploy my Baneblade on my left flank, my Hellhammer on the right flank. I actually separate them for this game. I then have 30 infantry supporting each one of these super heavies. I've got a senior officer supporting them. And then I take 40 infantry and I deploy them completely on the line, as far forward as I can go. The rest of my stuff is about 6 inches back from my edge of my deployment zone, but these 40 infantry string out as far as they can, and they present themselves with a very visible target. Now, I know the mind of an Ork player. Even the most competitive Ork player cannot and will not give up the opportunity for a first turn charge. I mean, it's a great opportunity for my opponent. They're going to get up the board even quicker if they're able to get a bunch of first turn charges off, and they'll be able to do damage to me turn 1, which they weren't really expecting, and it just makes sense for them to come at me and do a lot of damage. But those are Krieg infantry, so they're more durable than they might expect. And also, even with all of the fact my opponent, when I put those 4 units down first, and my opponent counter deployed by just putting everything on the line. And even if my opponent does get first turn, even if they do get those first turn charges and, you know, run across the battlefield and everything, the thing is that there's a lot of dense terrain on the board, guys, which screws my movement over, but also screws her movement over. And it means that there is the possibility for a lot of turn 1 charges, but many of those charges are going to be suffering a -2 to charge modifier, which is not good. And so what ends up happening is my opponent deploys everything on the line just to go after 40 sacrificial infantry, which I've already written off. And so they think that they're getting the turn 1 charge they want, but in reality, either they move forward and set themselves up for a load of turn 1 charges and fail them, at which point they are stuck right out in the open, or they make a bunch of turn 1 charges, but then again, I've lost the infantry I don't mind losing, and then I kill their stuff. Or, option number 3, which would have been beautiful, is my opponent sets up for a turn 1 charge, puts everything on the line, doesn't get turn 1, and suddenly loses 50% of their army in my first turn bonanza shooting phase. Sadly, option number 3 did not come to pass. But I'm telling you now, guys, if I had got turn 1, based on how aggressive my opponent's deployment was, based on the fact that I would have been able to get all 100 infantry shooting straight away, both Baneblades shooting straight away, I would have been in rapid fire range with probably 40 of my infantry. There's a real possibility I would have won the game in my turn 1 shooting phase if I had gone first. Sadly, or maybe not sadly, because it did make the game a lot more interesting, I did not get the first turn, and my opponent did get turn number 1. Now, my opponent's turn 1 is typically Orky. It's a Goth pressure list. She goes all in. Unit of Squig Boys go up round the top left flank. One comes round the top right flank. One unit of these Boar Riders goes down the middle. And then we've also got the Mega Knobs and Gaz that start slowly but surely coming round the right flank. And then basically this massive boys and Gretchen just power down the middle of the board. And the Gretchen end up holding the objectives. But when it comes to first turn charges, because of all the dense terrain, even with Here We Go, most of the charges fail. And in fact, the only unit that gets a charge off was a unit of Beast Snagger Boys that had been jumped 9 inches away from my front rank of infantry. And they do make it into 2 squads of Krieg. Now, the Beast Snaggers do badly maul the Krieg. I'm not going to lie, they badly maul them. And I end up losing, I think, most of both squads. I think I only had like 2 or 3 guys left by the end of the Beast Snagger rampage. But that was fine, because I had expected to lose all 40 infantry. So in my mind, I was like, hey, I'm 20 infantry up. I haven't lost all 40. I've lost about 20, but I haven't lost all 40. It then swings over to guard turn 1. And I'm actually in a position that I'm comfortable with. Yeah, I'm not going to get any primary turn 2. There's no way. Just the way my opponent's moved, there's no way I'm going to get it. And my opponent is sat on 5 objectives currently. But I reckon I can take my opponent down to just 2 objectives. Because 2 of the objectives that she's holding is with like 10 grots. That's not a problem. And most of her other units are massively exposed. And so what I do first is, in my command phase, I order some move on some key units, then everyone else gets first rank fire, second rank fire. I didn't go for take aim because my opponent had called a war, 5 invulnerable save. I might as well go for as many auto wounds as possible. So, and also I can ignore the fact that first rank fire, second rank fire makes me have heavy las guns because I've got the big bullshit banner which ignores to hit modifiers for the majority of my infantry that are going to be shooting this turn. With the units that move, I then set up a load of roadblocks. So I move a unit to block off the Squig Boys that are working their way around the top left flank. I do the same to the unit that's coming around the bottom right flank, and I string a unit across the top left middle bit so that where the majority of my opponent's units are coming through, basically they can't actually move through. The only area where I'm not move blocking is in the middle right, but there's just Gaz and the boys coming down there, and they're very, very slow because they're all mega knobs and everything. Then my shooting opens up. I'm very careful with the units I'm selecting because I actually only go after one of the Squig Rider Boy units because they're move blocked. What's actually a threat to me is the units that can breach through those ruins. And so I end up targeting as many boy units as I can, and I end up basically wiping out all of the boys and the Gretchen that I can see. And at the end of my first turn, there's a lot of Squig Riders left over, but they're penned in, and my opponent has essentially lost 20 Gretchen, 20 Beast Snaggers, and 20 of the Ork boys. Which means the only unit of infantry that's actually left to fight me is one unit of Beast Snaggers, because there's a unit of Gretchen holding my opponent's backfield objective, and there's a unit of boys that are holding the bottom right objective. And they have to sit on there to get the primary points. It swings over to my opponent's turn 2, and they're in actually a tricky situation, because Gaz and the Mega Knobs are still a turn out. They're not going to get to me until turn 3, and the Squig Hog boys can only really charge into 30 Guardsmen, which are move blocking them. And that's it. I'm okay with this. Predictably, those 30 Guardsmen do get munched. My opponent does to jump that unit of boys or Beast Snaggers, whatever it was that was left over. Actually, by back lines, I'd left a gap open foolishly. I'd been so focused on what I was blocking up front, I'd left a gap in the back. The unit of boys dropped down there with the jump and end up getting a charge on my command squad, but thanks to overwatching with the Flamer in the command squad and also playing Cadian stands with them, I only lose, I think, 3 models, including the Officer of the Fleet from that squad, and then I end up basically killing a few of them in combat and finishing them off at the beginning of my turn 2. But it comes back over to my turn 2, and my opponent has once again moved their units, and they are controlling a lot of objectives again, but this time they're sort of just sat in the middle of the board again. So there are Goth Pressures that's meant to pin me in my deployment zone. Because I've targeted those units that can breach, they're actually just fighting me across the middle of the board. They've not penned me in at all. So it comes to my turn to, and I'm like, right, well, obviously all those Squig boys have got to die. So I kill all of the Squig Riders. The Hellhammer annihilates one squad, the Baneblade annihilates another squad, and the remaining infantry, of which I have taken about 50 infantry casualties, but the remaining infantry and some split fire from the Baneblades, because I fired the infantry first so I knew how much I'd have left over to go into that last unit, boys, ends up picking the third squad up. It swings back around to my opponent's turn 3. Now, bear in mind, I didn't score any primary turn 2, and I haven't really moved on to enough objectives to guarantee I'm getting any primary turn 3. But I'm okay with that because I am confident that I'll be able to actually win the primary game in the end, because I've kept my opponent down to just scoring 4 primary returns. So they're not dominating on the primary the way they need to be. Comes over to my opponent's turn 3, and it's 2 units of Meganobs, the big boss Squig guy, and Gaz. And that's really it. There's a weird boy knocking around as well, but he can't really do what he needs to do. My opponent maybe should have jumped those Meganobs, but I think they were using them to try and set up a turn 3 killing blow. But the problem is that I have blasted through my opponent's army so quickly with so much firepower that it comes to my opponent's turn 3 and they're like, oh, the Meganobs are kind of in position, but there's still just a bunch of infantry for them to kill. And so the unit of Meganobs that's working its way round the bottom right flank with Gaz end up sort of moving forward, shooting a bit. They try and get some long bomb charges, but there's dense terrain in the way, and they fail. By the way, I just want to say it's really sad using smokescreen against Ork rockets because they go to hit on 6s. My opponent must have fired dozens of rockets at me this game. I think about 3 of them hit. I think one of them ended up getting a wound. And then I just saved it. Because the reason why they struggled to wound so much was because I thought it was 9 and rockets strength 8. So little side note, Ork rocket boys are sad when they go against Baneblades. But it goes around to my opponent's turn 3. Like I said, they're firing off these rockets. The big Squig guy goes into a unit of 10 infantry because, again, I've move blocked him again in my turn 2 because he can't breach through walls either. The Meganobs do end up getting a charge on one of my infantry squads on the left flank, but it was 10 infantry holding an objective. Fine. If a unit of 5 Meganobs just kills 10 infantry and then sits out there with their dicks in their hands, pissing into the wind, whilst they're facing down a Baneblade, then I'm okay with that. So it comes over to my turn 3, and I kill both squads of Meganobs and the big boss. And it's just Gaz left over at that point. And I actually set myself up because I know I'm going to score turn 4 and I know I'm going to score turn 5. And at this point, my opponent has completely run out of steam. I have survived the Goth pressure list. I have kept them off the primaries. I have kept them from pinning me into my zone. I have move blocked them effectively. I have pinned down their units, ironically, rather than them pinning my units down. And so it gets to turn 4. My opponent tries to do a bit of a rampage with Gaz, but Gaz actually does all right. Gaz ends up making a charge into one of my Hellhammers, into my Hellhammer, and he does a lot of damage to it. But I hadn't used a lot of CP at this point. I think I just used Ingrained Precision and maybe Smokescreen like once. And so what ended up happening was that I just used ablative plating on the Hellhammer, and Gaz, who should have killed it in one go, and don't forget he had a 5% vulnerable save on the Hellhammer, Gaz ends up doing like 18 wounds to it, but it's still rocking around on 12 runes. And then because I overwatched Gaz, did 4 wounds to him, and then I hit him with my attacks, I end up getting a couple past his armor save. I do like another 4 wounds to Gaz, so Gaz ends up taking a lot of damage in my opponent's turn 4. In my turn 4, I end up staying in combat with the Hellhammer because because of the terrain, I can't actually fall it back. There's nothing I can do about it. And so what happens is I end up shooting Gaz and killing him whilst I'm fixed in combat with him with the shooting. And then Gaz goes Orks is never beaten, and he kills my Hellhammer on death. But that was in my turn 4. So going to my opponent's turn 5, he's got 3 units left. He's got 1 unit of boys that are behind a ruin that my opponent had failed to jump in one of their final turns. He's got 1 unit of boys that are on an objective behind a ruin and 1 unit of grots. And that's it. Now, the game at this point is actually incredibly close because my opponent is able to score 4 primary points every single turn. And I only scored 8 primary in my turn 4. So it looked like my opponent was really ahead. We'd both been essentially equally doing data scry salvage with the tertiary part of that. So, and secondary is looking pretty close because we'd both taken no prisoners. I'd done well on inflexible, of course. I had struggled a little bit on boots. Because obviously I've been pinned a lot of the time in just 2 table quarters. My opponent has done pretty well on no prisoners. They've done great on get the shiny bits, and they've done okay on engage. So the game's actually really close, and it's going to come down to 1 or 2 points. And so what I do is I end up in my opponent turn 5, they just sit there. They're like, I'm not doing anything. I'm not exposing anything. I don't want to expose any no prisoner points. In my turn 5, I go for a speed run. I go for a thunder run. And what I do is I tell my Vaunted Praetorian, my Baneblade, the only one that's left over, I tell him to go full throttle, which means he gets 2 extra inches on his movement. So even though he's going over some dents, he still goes 10 inches. And then he gets to advance and still counter stationary even though he's advanced. And he gets the big 6, which means overall he's able to go 16 inches. And he zooms from the top left flank to the top right flank. This allows him to draw line of sight onto the unit of boys that were trying to hide behind a ruin. Not even an objective, to hide behind a ruin. He's able to fire at full capacity without any problems, and he completely blows away that unit of boys without even breaking a sweat. As a result, I end up getting an extra 2 victory points because it got me over the 100 mark for no prisoners, and then that also got me an extra point for killing another 10 wounds. So that was pretty good. Now, at the end of the game, it was actually really close. It was 78 to the guard and 74 to the Orks. Even without that thunder run, I would have just about pinched it. But I hadn't worked out the points exactly in my head, but I knew it was going to be really, really tight. And that just goes to show the power of the Goth pressure list. It did exactly what it was meant to do. And if it had been facing against anyone else who didn't quite have the screening capability or didn't have the long range firepower to be able to kill those units that were on those objectives. You know, the fact that I had the big range on the Baneblade, I had the big range on the Hellhammer, that 36-inch range really making a big difference. That was what allowed me to end up pulling the game back. The fact that I could delay my opponent's pressure whilst destroying the units that were actually scoring them victory points. And that was it. It's a one-day tournament, guys. So end of game 3 means end of the event. And once all the points had been calculated, I ended up coming second, which is one of the best singles results I've ever had. Now, even taking into account the fact that I got the bye, I think I would have still won that first game, which means that I think I legitimately got that second place. I am wholeheartedly happy I didn't get first, which might sound a bit unusual, but if I had got first and I had beaten someone who had also won 3 games, but I had won because I got 100 points on the bye, that just wouldn't have felt right. So fortunately, nature took care of it. The universe made sure that things happened the way it should happen. And I ended up getting second, which I was pretty happy with. And the person that came first, who was using Genestealer Cult, ended up getting a very deserved first place because he played 3 games against 3 tough opponents. He was taking on Botan and some of the other really hard stuff that was there. Custodes as well, both armies that are very good at the moment. And he ended up playing his little heart out and doing really well and absolutely smashing the event and getting the first. So well done to that Genestealer Cult player for making the Day of Ascension an absolute success. Just before we wrap up this video, I want to just give you guys some final thoughts on how I felt the list played and the event went in general. Overall, I was really happy with it. I think the Baneblades actually performed really well and they took every single opponent by surprise. Guard Super Heavies have been dog shit for so long that when you put one on the table, it might look imposing, but people instinctively are kind of dismissive of it. And I had a lot of people at the event going, oh man, you're brave for bringing those, bloody hell, double Baneblade, oh my god, you know, all this kind of stuff. And I ended up coming second with them, and I ended up smashing every opponent that I faced off with them. They have a lot of firepower. Okay, they really do bring a huge amount of DACA to the table, and unlike Guard, Leman Russes, or their equivalent points in other tanks, they don't mind getting into combat. They shouldn't be your first port of call with them, but if someone ties up a Leman Russ in combat, it's kind of taken out of the fight. If someone ties up a Baneblade in combat, it's either going to run them over, or it's going to overwatch them and smash the crap out of them then, or if they don't wrap it up, it's just going to fall back and act as normal because it's a goddamn Titanic unit. So I do think that they're actually pretty good. The one problem with the Baneblades is they struggle with terrain. Even on these boards that had taken into account big models and wanted people to use those cool things, I generally only had one way to go. And in my second game, I had to deploy in a way that really put my Baneblades at risk. If I'd faced off against someone that could launch a Repentia bomb across the board or something like that, I would have been in a really, really tricky situation. So the Baneblades are great. They bring a lot of firepower. The only weakness of the Baneblade is not the unit itself, is the boards that they find themselves forced to play on in most competitive games. But that's all we've got time for today, guys. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have, make sure you smash that like button like it's your big titty Eldar girlfriend, and also subscribe to never miss an episode. Let me know what you think down in the comment section as well. Let me know what other kind of list you want to see me take to tournaments. This one was obviously more of a fun one, but if you've got any other wacky or meme ideas, put it down in that comment section. And of course, also, if you want me to try out certain units and let you know how they perform on the tabletop or in a tournament setting, of course, let me know down in that comment section. And if you really enjoyed today's video and you want to see more content like this, more tournament after action reports, then please consider becoming a channel member or Patreon supporter. Channel membership and Patreon support really is the lifeblood of this channel. It allows me to go to more tournaments. It allows me to do Mordian Glory full time. And I just want to say a massive thank you to all of my current Patreon supporters and channel members. You guys are fantastic. Thank you so much for doing your part. But that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed today's video. Thank you for watching. And of course, as always, I'll see you guys next time.